Hello, I'm Richard Adams, an often performing member at the Wayne Theater. And today, in this pandemic, we thought it'd be a good time to do a little bit of history of the Wayne. And I've got three key players today in the history of the Wayne Theater. But first of all, let's go back to 1926 when Carl Loth and James Patterson opened the Wayne during the Roaring '20s. And then in 1949, after World War II, Americans were just flying to the theaters all over the country. And there was no TV yet, so they'd go watch the talking pictures, so to speak. And in 1949, they doubled the size of the Wayne Theater, added to the bathrooms, and just made it fancier, basically. 1980, there was a concession fire, and during that concession fire, they divided the theater into two halves. And in 1999, they deeded the theater to the city of Waynesboro, and that's pretty much where we're going to start today. So here we go. It's pandemic time, and it's time to learn about the history of the Wayne Theater. Good afternoon, and today we're going to interview Tracy Weaver-Straight. Wave out, it's Tracy. They didn't know who you are. There we go. And she's a longtime board member and director of the Wayne Theater. Bill Hausrath, longtime chair. I'm Richard Adams hosting, and Clair Myers over from Monterey, Virginia, is the director of the Wayne from 2000, I think you said 6, but he actually started on the board in 2005. We're going to talk about the history of the Wayne Theater during this pandemic, and this is the way you do things during the pandemic. So anyway, Tracy, in 1998, Lillian Morris was around, and she said something to you. What did she say to you?
Well, we had just come off of doing a musical together where she was the director and I was the music director. And she knew I was on the Waynesboro Cultural Commission at the time and teaching music in the schools. And she said, would your kids ever want to perform on stage at the Wayne Theater? And I said, what are you talking about, Lillian? Knowing that this building was closed. And that's pretty much how it all got started. We met for coffee and then brainstormed some names of who we felt like may have an interest as well in either trying to preserve a historic building, to always, there was an educational type of component in the conversation of music and theater. And I remember bringing a table and chairs to what was the concession area that led to the bathrooms and just setting it up there and having conversations and one to another.
Cool. Bill, in 1999, what happened?
Well, in '99, RC Theaters gave the theater building to the city, and of course that required the city to accept it. And so RC Theaters got rid of what they were now carrying as pretty much a liability on their books. It had no economic value. It was full of asbestos and lead-based paint and had a bad roof. And they managed in a real nice card trick to slide that over to the city of Waynesboro. Okay. And of course, they came at it with the idea of optimism and what they could make of it.
Yeah, and what did they make of it? And what happened to the building after Waynesboro got it?
Well, they took the Cultural Commission, and Tracy may jump in on this because she was there, but they took the Cultural Commission. My mother was chairman of that commission, and they said to the Cultural Commission, what do we do with this building now that we've got it? Because we know it's more than the city of Waynesboro can do, and we'd kind of like to see you guys take it. And my understanding is that the Cultural Commission did a lot of thinking and came back and said, this project is a big project and it needs its own organization to make it into what it can become.
Yeah. Do either any of you know the history of the Cultural Commission by any chance, what happened?
It's still in existence.
Okay. And what was it doing back then? Just what kind of things did the Cultural Commission do?
We tried a variety of projects from hosting platforms to try to pull together what all the area cultural groups were doing onto a single calendar. Charles Salambier was part of the Cultural Commission, and he had a Virginia Commission for the Arts Presence. He was on that board. we had a very small budget to manage, but it was a great communication group to help express what was happening with the arts in our community, but also in our greater community.
Okay. You know, when did the actual Wayne Theater Alliance begin?
That was 2000.
2000, yeah. And who do you remember? Either of you or Claire may know some of the actual members of that first board figures. So Lillian was the chair. Is this right? Who was the chair?
Lillian was the
At
chair.
that time, Lillian.
Yeah, Lillian was the chair.
There's so many that have come through the years. Jerry Spooner, even Donald Dollins and Diane Wade, and
My mom was on that theater board
yes.
as it cranked up.
Okay, yeah.
So,
And I'll just let you know that both Tracy and Bill grew up in Waynesboro. Tracy's dad was the assistant police chief. Bill's dad was a chemist, and your mother obviously was very interested in the community, and I guess from both ends. And Claire has moved in from out of town, and we'll get to him in a minute. So hang on, Claire. We got you. You're listening.
I'm here.
If you have anything to add, please add it. So, all right. And so give me the feel of the Wayne Theater Alliance when it started up. What did you start doing?
Well, we tried to just start gaining names of support and contacts, and we literally sat in a room, and if someone, we wouldn't do this today, you know, was part of different clubs and churches and organizations, brought their list together, and we went through, and oh, they may have an interest because they love history, or they may have an interest because they have kids. Today, doing it again, we would have accepted all names. I also made a trifold and would sit at the summer extravaganza, which is a long time event. And we created a Friends of the Wayne, sitting at a card table with this display of old pictures of the Wayne and, you know, some ideas, just trying to gather names.
Okay.
Contacts.
And it obviously worked, and so because y'all knew the town, you knew the players in the town.
yeah, that first year they also they incorporated, got their bylaws written, became a 501c3. They interviewed Killis Ullman architects, historic theater architects. They joined the League of Historic American Theaters. You know, they were busy. They were in those early times of forming an organization. And they got it off. I mean, that's a critical part, is to get the organization up and running.
Okay, yeah.
We had feasibility studies.
When did you start raising money or grants? Were there grants in the early phases of this?
2002, we received our nonprofit status.
Okay, all right. So you were going along, things were moving along pretty good, and then 2003, 2004, the same thing's going on. You're still.
We started to create events for people to come together to allow more of a platform to talk about the Wayne and gain more support.
Okay, and what kind of events would these be?
We had a grand gala at the old Heilig Myers funeral furniture store, Heilig Myers furniture store, and it was one of those events where it was a first event, and there was huge enthusiasm about it. I think we had 300, maybe 325 people that came to it. And, you know, you always laugh about these things now, but I remember I was on vacation in Mexico, and I got a call. At that point, I was chairman, and I got a call saying that the fire chief had decided that we were not properly zoned to host that event, and that event was literally going off at the end of that week. And so because of a very active city manager who got involved, and he had all of the exits and everything covered with firemen in their dress uniforms, and we were able to pull off the event, and it was a grand event.
That was real theater, man.
Yeah.
I mean, actual firemen.
Yeah, I think there's a point in here that you need to pick up. Lillian Morris was diagnosed with cancer, and her husband, Joe, told me that she looked around Waynesboro to see who could take over. and make it happen. And she decided that Bill Hausrath was the person. So she literally called him to her deathbed and got him promised to take over the Wayne Theater Alliance, which he did. And then they moved it to where we started raising funds like the party they just mentioned.
Give us the quote from Lillian, Bill, when she called you to decide in that board meeting.
The gist of it was she had realized at that point that it was a real estate project before it was an arts project. And she said to me, she said, "I'm going to be dead in 45 days and you're going to be chairman."
That's an executive order.
And she was a director and a producer, and she was good at it.
She directed you to what to do.
She chose me for the part.
And speaking of directors, in 2005, Claire out there joined the board, correct? Where did you come from, Claire? Give me your background.
We moved to Waynesboro in 2004. My wife took a church pulpit, and I decided that I needed to become involved in something. So I noticed on the city channel that there was openings for the Historic Commission and the Cultural Commission. So I sent a letter saying that I would volunteer to be on either one, and gave my background as history and my background in theater. And I got appointed to both of them. Because obviously nobody else had applied. And at the Cultural Commission, Tracy came. Charles Sombier was the chair at that point. Tracy came and did an update on the Shenandoah Moon project, and that was the first that I heard about the Wayne Theater. So I decided that I had a background in fundraising and building theaters and whatnot. So I think I must have sent a letter to Bill or someone suggesting that I would like to be of help if they needed it. And so when you do that, you get put on the board. So I joined the board in 2005, sometime, must have been fairly early. And in that year, they decided there was enough grants coming. They had one from Nintelos and an annual grant, a small one, and a small grant from Augusta County Tourism. And there was some money from the Virginia Historic Commission. So they had enough money to hire executive director. So I was off in Pennsylvania directing a show, and I decided I'll apply for the job. So I remember going down to the post office in this tiny little college town and mailing off an application with a resume. And in 2006, I was interviewed with, I think, 3 or 4 other people were called in at that time. And I think the thing that decided them on me was that at the end of asking me all their kinds of questions, the interview committee, I handed them a list of the things that I thought that the Wayne ought to be doing now in the next 5 years. And so anyway, I was hired. And I decided that I didn't know enough so that I wouldn't take the full salary. We'd split it and use it to hire somebody who knew the media and other people in the area. And that was Crystal Graham. So that I started in 2006 with Crystal.
Thinking you'd already retired, right? From your other job.
Yeah, I was well at retirement age.
Bill?
Yeah, that's. I just want to make sure he filled in that story. I think it says an awful lot about Clair when he took the job, and I sort of laugh about this, but again, he came from professordom, having served as a dean in a college, and was used to support. Lots of good ideas, lots of writing, but he needed support. He recognized that, and he recognized we only had a certain amount of money, and so he literally took half salary in order to fill out the position the way it needed to be, and that was a great move on his part, because it really advanced the mission of the theater a lot.
Yeah, so he went from a school teacher's salary, public school teacher salary, to the custodian salary,
Yeah.
and he still ends up sweeping the porch every morning.
He still ended up sweeping the gateway and everything else.
My best memories of Claire are of him out there. He'd have the broom out sweeping the gateway, man. He'd be out there in front of sweeping the gateway. And I remember your dad ran a gas station, right, Claire? Is that right?
Among other things, yeah.
Yeah, and I can picture the gas station guy out there in the front cleaning the Tracy, do you have memories of that time? You were on the board. You've been on the board since basically the beginning, right? You went from board to director in a mere 17, 18 years.
In 22 years, Richard.
22 years, man.
My children were born into this. Well, a lot of my involvement, was a volunteer until later years, but, we just tried to create events and support and reasons for people to come together and have the conversation. And Claire, kicked off the capital campaign. And we knew through the studies it was going to take more funding than the individuals and businesses' local support, although I believe it's one of the greatest amounts raised in the area by local individuals and businesses. And so, Bill and others just came on board that had the knowledge base of the tax credits and that usage. So many people have been involved along the way on so many different levels. We created this parade of events where we were having events every single month. For many years, Jane Fost and Carol Hill kicked off a Christmas home tour that we had for many years.
So,
yeah, when I came on, I thought that one of the things was that the profile of the Wayne Theater had to be greater than it was. So one of the tasks was to create activities and a support base. And I used the Cultural Commission as part of that to develop some programming that we could do and use a little bit of their money in the process. We also made decals that went on businesses downtown saying, "I support the Wayne Theater." And so Tracy's right. I mean, the project was all about making the community understand the importance that what kind of an asset that the Wayne could be for the community and for the region. And at that time, we were in competition with the Stanton Performing Arts, which was trying to do the same sort of thing with the Dixie, which was not a shuttered building, but one that they could use. And the Paramount was just getting ready to open at that time. So we were not alone in trying to tap resources out there. And just as we began, the real kickoff to move on fundraising for it, the recession hit, and it really whacked us big time at that point. So what I think we would have been able to move a lot faster on became pretty difficult.
Yeah.
What were some of, tell me, when did the Gateway start?
2011.
2011. Yeah. So there were events, there was Third Fridays, Claire, I think. Right.
Yeah, before that, we, I created the radio hour through the Cultural Commission, actually. And we would go around town. We did some in what was the old store over at
the old Radio Shack.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, Radio Shack, right.
I remember that well.
Yeah, and Bill had some platforms up at his place, and we had to get the city to shuttle them back and forth so we'd have a stage, and we kept it to an hour at that point. So we did 2 shows, 6:30 and 7:30, I think, or something like that. And it was my chance to live out my fantasy of having a radio TV show of my own. So I got to be the host, and I got to put together local talent and a studio band, which was the Boogie Kings. So we had that going, and that became a kind of constant.
I wanted to back up a little bit because I think it's very important to note that in the early days, the city was able to fund us internationally known theater consultant, Janice Barlow.
Okay.
And if I remember right, the city actually had her in twice. The first time was under that, in that first year, where they brought her in and she reported to the community in the city council building. And that's actually where Lillian approached me. But then we had her in again, and then the city actually funded $45,000 worth of design work to just, do the basics of looking at the building and scoping it out and seeing what we had. Along about that time, we were also able to apply for and get 2 Virginia grants. And I want to say the total was somewhere upwards of $500,000 and a federal earmark grant. And those grants gave us the ability to really get busy and start looking at the architecture of the building. And this was all taking place in the 2004, 5, 6, 7 range. Claire and I and others made multiple trips over to Bushman Dreyfus Architects in Charlottesville. And prior to that time, we'd had sort of a cook-off between the architects. And we chose them among, I believe, 3 participants or three competitors for the design work. We toured the Paramount. I think it's important to note that, golly day, we went to League of Historic American Theater conventions. We saw other theaters. We did multiple trips to Richmond to look at their performing arts center out in Glen Allen. We did trips to the Paramount Theater and saw it in construction and what they were dealing with, both in the pluses and the minuses. So a great deal of time and energy was spent in those years, in addition to keeping an organization running, trying to raise some money, and trying to do programming. We were also busy trying to figure out what the Wayne was going to be and what it was going to look like. And we were trying to figure out how to use these new markets tax credits and the historic credits, because we had people like Mimi Stadler, who became our consultant in the preservation of the theater. So it was a very involved time, even though you look at it and say, gosh, what did you guys do in 2004, 5, 6, and 7? Because we really, I didn't see a whole lot of building going on. But yeah, it has been a busy organization all along. And then when Claire came on board, our whole level of involvement intensity ramped up dramatically. And then we'd say that again when the Gateway opened. And at that point, Tracy really jumped in, and that was a real learning curve for both of them. But they were intensely involved in creating programming and booking programming and beginning to manage a theater. I feel like I'm taking too much time here, Richard, but
no, you're doing fine.
There just was an awful lot going on that you don't see unless you take it apart like you're doing right now.
Right, and when we say behind the scenes, you're trying to run, and Claire, we lost you for a minute there. You even magically switched screens. You went to the southwest corner, just like Monterey. It was great, to the screen. Bill went to the northwest. No, you went to the southeast corner, and Bill went to the northwest corner. But Claire, you were finish up about. We lost you for a second there. You were talking about when you started the radio hour, and you had just moved into the Gateway. Any comments there about acts and how that was working?
Oh, yeah.
What kind of education it was for the group, for you and Trace especially?
Yeah. Just step back just slightly. When I applied for the executive director, was not to run the theater. my goal was really to get it opened, but to make sure that it was a functioning theater, because I had spent enough of my career as a professor and director in buildings that were not really where the emphasis had been placed on lobbies and glamour and that sort of thing, and not the function of the theater. So that was my goal. And so things like a fly loft and orchestra pit and whatnot. So that was part of it. So when we did when the Gateway, it was Bill's idea to take that over, as I remember. And what it meant was we went from doing the radio show once a month to doing 2 shows plus each week at the Gateway. And so that meant that I had to learn programming, how to do grants with the VCA, and find other sources, and take care of bathrooms and whatnot, and build a volunteer corps that would hand out programs and take tickets and whatnot. So we built a theater, we put a stage in, we put in curtains. Gary Kirby came along and did lights and sound for us. We built a platform for the technical area. We bought chairs, which I remember arriving, and a bunch of people helped unload and stack in there. So it was a real, bootstrap sort of organization when we first started the Gateway. And we did that, I believe, 3 years.
Yeah, John Curry helped build that stage, right?
Well, he helped put on, yes, he did. He did some of that.
Frank Mapstone.
Frank Mapstone and Danny Leach. And a lot of people jumped in with John. John was a great motivator to bring people together.
Yeah.
And really jumped in to do that. But it was, as Claire says, a real effort of a lot of people to learn a lot about different things very quickly.
Tracy, when you were, so you're still on the board, this whole time you're on the board, and you're starting at 98, 99, whatever. And were you seeing yourself as possibly being director when Claire had finished putting the theater together, so to speak?
Well, Claire encouraged, first of all, in the early years, I went back to school while teaching and getting my master's for a leadership type of position. And he introduced me to APAP. And of course, I was already involved with LHAP.
So explain this to a guy like me what APAP and LPAP are.
LHAT is the League of Historic American Theaters.
Okay.
And APAP is the professional organization for presenters.
Okay.
And that just really changed the ball game. And I knew that my role, once we started the Gateway, because that was a big new thing, starting the Gateway, it was learning all I could about the business and about running a theater, whether it be to help our current situation with the Gateway, but just starting to build relationships and making connections on a different level. And starting to also be involved more with more regional platforms, the Mid-Atlantic Arts Association, connecting with other theaters. The Paramount was significant and still is. And the Virginia Commission for the Arts. So there are lots of components. The League of Historic Theaters, we still rely on them for many things within the theater. That's how we made the connection with who we were going to go with for the seats for the theater.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to go back, Bill, to the key point with the city with the $300,000 and our roof. There was clearly a decision to be made of whether to level the theater for $300,000 or to fix the roof and allow the group of the Wayne Theater Alliance to spend some time.
So, as the story unfolded, I've said that, of course, the city accepted the building. They took the liability, created an organization that they hope to to bring it to the catalyst for what they wanted their city to be. About the mid-2000s, I say 2005, 2006, there was a conservative element that developed on city council that was very much anti-spending anything on money, spending any money on anything that wasn't related to pure government. So what happened was it became a real examination about what should happen with this theater and what the city's role should be. And so we were in the process of trying to say, what are we going to need to make this work? And we had begun to understand the new markets tax credits and the intensity of development and how that was going to work. And if we got the money, how it had to be paid back. And so I determined that we were going to have $1 million in support from the city. And that we were going to need an initial injection to move us forward. And that created a big discussion about what to do with the theater on a political standpoint. And so it became apparent to those that were thinking about it that for $300,000, they could tear down the theater and create a parking lot. And then they wouldn't have to worry about putting any more money in it. And a second effort might be to tear off the roof for $300,000 and put a new roof on the building and mothball it and let it go till better days might surface and the money would be easier to get. And the third alternative was to fund the WTA with $300,000 and let them use that money to move the project forward. I would say that the arts group had a 3-2 majority on council at that point, and they voted to put $300,000 in it instead of tearing it down or instead of mothballing it. And at the same time, to direct the city manager to direct the Economic Development Authority to put together a performance agreement that would create a path to that total $1 million, another $700,000. And again, it was political, but the final agreement said that when we finished the theater, when we had a certificate of occupancy, we were to get $200,000 as a bonus, and that the other $500,000 would be paid out over a period of years based on our economic impact into the city of Waynesboro. And that agreement was signed off on in 2008, and that agreement was critical to the Wayne Theater Alliance taking the deed to the theater, remembering that at this point, it's an empty shell that has no economic value and needed $800 or $8 million worth of work to make it viable. And so we signed the deed, we signed off on the agreement, and the city signed over the deed, and we recorded the deed, which means at that point we accepted the liability for that building. There was a clause in the deed, though, that said that if at any point in time we lost control of it, that it had to come back to the city. So the city was still tentative in giving us the complete authority over that building. In the 2008 elections, the entire political landscape changed. Council went over to a majority of a conservative vote. The three on city council who's, we look at various points in our transition from a defunct building to an operating theater and say these were critical points. It was a critical point that we had Tom Reynolds and Lori Smith and Nancy
Dowdy,
thank you. I momentarily lapsed on that, but those three were the majority on council, and they voted for the performance agreement, and they made it happen. Without that vote, we wouldn't have what we have today. And so we went forward at that point, even though the political landscape had changed completely and people had gotten elected on the slogan of "No more money for the Wayne." So it was at that point that we entered our fundraising with a lot of the city not being in support of funding the Wayne. It is critical to note that at no time, although many politicians over these next years have said no money for the Wayne, at no time did City Council act as a body to withdraw the performance agreement or to change that performance agreement. And if you would like for me to ramble on for a minute more about performance agreements, I can do that also.
Yeah, well, basically, you told me what a performance agreement was, and it's an agreement that once the theater had been done, you would get a certain amount of money, and you never got that money. So
no, we never got it. But it's very important to recognize that performance agreements are what municipalities use to encourage private enterprise and civic groups to perform something for the city, whether it's to build a shopping center or to encourage investment in industry. That's what they use to be the word and bond of the city. So, and they are never defaulted on by the localities. So we have a city at this point that has defaulted on their performance agreement.
Tracy?
It's a little disheartening in the sense that I believe this is the only performance agreement that our city has had that was with a group of volunteers, wasn't with a big business or for-profit entity. And so for that reason in itself, that this group of community volunteers set out on this major journey, which it still is, to accomplish what they did. In a sense, you know, it started by volunteers, it was worked through the years with volunteers, and is being given back to our community as a gift. It is a gift in our city on so many levels, historically, economically, culturally. And a big positive thing that has come out of it is we have continued to stay positive and to persevere. And there have been speed bumps along the way. You know, we started and stopped construction 3 times, and there's a cost to that each and every time. But our doors open March of 2016. Strong.
Claire?
What I'm listening to that perspective on it all. Once we got the money from the city, we also went to Goodlatte. And at that time, he was not quite as conservative about bringing money in. And he got us a HUD grant. I think it was $300,000 or something like that, which allowed us to really move on to starting the reconstruction of the place. And we continued through with Bushman and Dreyfus during that period of time. And we had a plan for the building finally, and some money to start some of the work on it. But then there were then it really meant opening up to other grants and to individuals in the town. For instance, Jenny Ross, who over the period of time must gave at least $1 million in that construction period of time, which without it, I don't think we could have managed it to get it done. And all of that accumulated to a point where we could move forward with historic tax credits and with the other kind of federal funds that we could bring in, and which at that point, Bill was crucial to working through, or I certainly couldn't have done it. I don't think Tracy knew enough about the ins and outs of that. So we got enough seed money that we then could move on to finally getting those other major resources that allowed the building to be done.
Thank you. So in 2009, you started construction, and you stopped construction. You started construction because the steel was cheap. According to Bill, he told me the steel was cheap because of the recession in 2008. And you got this steel, and then you stopped. You started again in 2011, or you stopped in 2011?
We started again in 2011.
Okay.
And then we stopped almost immediately. All of our construction was timed to the acceptance of our New Markets Tax Credit program. The most complicated thing I've ever done in my life. Still don't understand it well enough to explain it to anybody. And we had opened our capital campaign in 2008, and we had gathered up a nice chunk of money, and we had some commitments. And the New Markets Tax Credit people said, go ahead and get started. This is going to happen any day. And so we did. We cut the building in half, and we dug out the orchestra pit, and we tore down the balcony and bought the steel, and you know, we moved forward like we were building the theater, and then you know, that all disappeared. You know, they weren't ready, and when you're doing a tax credit, you are absolutely dependent upon your consultants and your attorneys, and this is a very, very specialized field. And so they made a mistake, and it wasn't time. We weren't ready, and so we shut down. But there we were with the building cut in half and the orchestra pit filling up with water for years.
And the gateway is still running.
Well, no, we hadn't started the gateway until 2011.
Okay, in 2011. Okay.
And we did kick off construction again, and then right back at, like an echo almost, they said, no, this is not right. And at that point, we were doing real heavy demolition and supporting. We were doing shoring work on the foundation because there were some problems with that. So that happened in 2011, and then we shut down. And so sort of simultaneously, we realized that we needed to be doing something, and that's when the gateway came around.
Okay. And that was 5 people on the board agreed to lease the building, and then kept running all the shows.
Well, there's two parts to that. There were 5 of us that said, okay, we'll do this. We formed a little LLC, and we signed a lease because we didn't feel like we could commit the Theater Alliance to that because we weren't ready. But as individuals, we believed in it, and we went forward. And of course, the theater made it happen. I mean, Clair and Tracy and it just charged into it, and the volunteers, and things just happened. And before you knew it, we had content, and we had people coming, and we had people excited. And the restaurants were saying, you know, gee, when you guys have a show, our business goes up. So that was exciting.
Yeah. One other thing, in 2014, Bill, tell me the story about the 176 signatures. And well, Clair and Tracy, please feel free to comment.
Yes. So we were again put on high alert for the New Markets credits in 2013, and it just didn't quite happen. And by 2014, our investor, U.S. Bank, basically gave us notice that if we didn't close in 2014, if we didn't have all of our money together and ready to close in 2014, then the deal was off, and we'd have to do something else. And so that was that was a lot of stress in that year trying to make that all happen. And Claire's got some stories about raising money and closing the gap. But when we finally did sign all the paperwork, I signed my name 176 times to different pieces of paper that essentially it's sometimes like I tell my clients, if you want to buy this house, sign this document. And it was like, if you want these tax credits, sign these documents. Don't ask a lot of questions because you won't understand it all, but sign these documents. And that's what we did. And I told the story to Richard how on the very last day that the city courthouse was recording documents for the year 2014, our entire future was dependent upon a courier arriving with the documents that had been signed by the other part and being recorded in 2014. And I stood at the courthouse hoping that he didn't have a flat tire because it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And that was it. And he was driving in from some far off place. But he got there and we got it recorded. And here we are.
Claire, what was going on in your life during that time?
Well, I was doing the Gateway. And I was up in, actually, when all of that was going on, I was in Pennsylvania directing a show. And I remember coming back and telling Tracy that I thought that, you know, this thing was going to not work out, that it just, we'd hit a wall here and it wasn't going to happen, but as it did. But even though Bill got the thing recorded and all written, there was a whole another year or more of trying to work through banks and other entities to get the money up front so we could do it before the other money came. It was one of the most complicated kind of negotiations I have ever seen and hope never to see again like that. It was just, you know, it could have all gone bad at any moment. Yeah, I remember collecting a group of bankers up in the upstairs of our office building, and you know, and getting them to commit to giving us the money that would let us get over the hump, so we could get to the next point. And they'd say yes, and then something would happen, and oh, Bill knows more of that.
Oh my gosh, that was so frustrating. We had all the banks in town that had so much to profit from this, but you know, we were still just a wish and a promise. And finally, the lender for our general contractor, the guy that was going to have the contractor, had the contracts to start and stop and start and stop, that lender said, I'll lend you the money that you need to bridge the gap. And again, as a critical point, if he hadn't said that, probably wouldn't be there. So there were just so many little tripwires all through the deal. But yes, it was an intense effort to find somebody to lend us that last $100,000, and everybody that we knew was tapped out at that point. So yeah.
Tracy, do you remember this?
Oh yes. The room with the bankers. You know, there's so many memories. The topping off ceremony in July, putting a tree on top of the roof and celebrating. You know.
Yeah.
The steps along the way.
So construction went on in 2016. And Claire, when did you officially leave?
In July of 2016.
And Tracy, you started you were transitioning about that time, right? Into the directorship?
Actually, she had begun a bit more than that before then. We knew I was going to retire at the end of my of the contract, which would have been July 1st, our fiscal year. And Tracy was doing a lot of the programming with me at that time and taking over the lead on most of the stuff. I never wanted to program the Wayne. I made that clear from point one. I was about getting the building open. And so Tracy stepped into that role and took on a larger role than just being an assistant at that point. They got rid of me by calling me executive director emeritus. So it gave me you know, something to put on a card. So, but and Tracy was then the executive director.
Okay. I want to go up there and change your name to Claire Myers, Director Emeritus, but I'm not going to do that right now because I'll misspell emeritus.
I think, you know, it's important too, you know, from a transition in an organization. There we had Claire, who had brought so much into what we were doing and had a hard exit that he wanted. But from a knowledge standpoint and a running of a theater, we were all still learning like crazy. And so Tracy, you know, through the Gateway, and we shut the Gateway down in 13, and we focused on fundraising and building the theater in 14 and 15. And so that whole time period in there was a transition of learning about what are we going to put on the stage, and how we're going to do this. So it was a huge time, but really from a volunteer standpoint, the day-to-day work was being done by staff, and we would roll in and be there. But whenever something was really happening, it was staff. That's without a great staff, it would never ever have happened.
Yeah,
So,
I would add to that the Gateway turned out to be a crucial activity for the Wayne, because if you look at the schedule over those 3 years that we operated, we essentially put in place the things that were now carried on to the Wayne Theater, except for, well, not even that. We did original plays there with Fitzgerald. We did movies consistently there. We did lectures consistent, and we did performances by local talent and regional and national talent. So the model for what the Wayne is doing now really came out of the times at the Gateway.
It's like a middle school theater, moving up to the high school level.
Yes.
yeah.
To the
And then when the Gateway closed, the construction decisions that had to be made, and we changed architects, a design, that is a phase. But I mean, on the daily, having to make the decisions and constantly meeting with every step of the construction phase was intense and stressful, and yet we needed to get something on the stage,
When we opened, yeah.
Yeah. I remember even in 13, I guess it's 14, 15, you were still running the radio show at Main Street Methodist Church. Then you lend them the chairs for they were working.
Yes.
Yeah. Three more buildings up the street. You own the three between there. So, but yeah.
I remember doing that and thinking, one thing, we had to go in and set the stage up every time. And then we had to break it all down so the room was clear for the church to use the thing. And I remember loading stuff in my car and driving it down to the Wayne office and thinking, why in the heck am I doing this kind of work? I am so glad that I'm going to get out of this, But without that became a way that we signaled who we were, and we were still alive and doing while the building was going forward.
And the crowds were still coming.
Yes, they were. We were charging. I remember when we went from y'all come kind of thing when we were over at the Radio Shack to where we charged $5. I think there was two women that were just incensed that we would ask for any kind of money for it, and they would always come before that and sit to where they could watch the keyboard, and they would see both shows for free, but they didn't want to pay $5 for anything. So, and the Gateway allowed us to move up to $10 for shows and more. So,
so finally in 2016, the theater opens, and somebody tell me when the theater opened.
March 1st, 2016.
March 1st, okay. And what happened, Tracy? What happened on March 1st?
We had a grand opening, and Peter Wilson and Aaron Clay were our entertainment, and Claire, Bill, and I first spoke and welcomed everyone, and we had the entertainment, and then the curtain raised, and it continued into a social event of the evening.
Okay. And did it seem surreal when that happened? Anybody? What's the right word for it? Satisfying?
Relief. I mean, a great sense of accomplishment to have, as Tracy pointed out before, no one in town had raised that kind of money for a nonprofit, event like that. Some of the churches may have come close to it, but nobody else had done something that was a cultural asset for the community at that level. So there was a real sense of pride in having accomplished that. And there's a photo I'm sure that Tracy will share with you with all the people that joined us on the stage and in front of the stage and to celebrate that cutting of the ribbon to open the Wayne Theater.
Well, we continue to learn, and this entire area has incredible talent. And so that's an important component to the theater, is our educational workshops and series and our Broadway musicals and plays. We've added plays as well now. So being able to be a spot where we can highlight the local talent is important. Presenting, that's where we're bringing in shows that are here today and gone tomorrow. That helps to expand this whole area culturally. And we're in a great location for people traveling to bigger cities up and down the interstates. Having something available for everyone. It's important that we have pay what you will events through our movies, our speaker series. We want the theater to be a place for all to come and enjoy. The movie component, the classic movies hosted by Jimmy Overton, is just very special. And it's a different take because there's a whole discussion component with it. And it's almost like seeing those old movies for the first time when you see them on the big screen. The personal connections and components of the theater are very important. And the memories, what we're talking about today, it's been the history of the Wayne. And we still are hearing the moments people share with us of their first date, of remembering watching White Christmas in 1956 with my mother, with, the stories that are shared are priceless. And it's the people, the patrons, our partners, our sponsors, our friends, all of the people along the way. Our slogan is "You are the star," and our word for the year has been inspiration. How so many people have inspired us to keep going. And we just really want to express that you are the star in all of this and will continue to be on the Wayne Theater stage.
Let me add one thing here. When I became involved with the theater, the goal was to be a presenting space, not a producing space. And I think that what Tracy has done is transitioned to a larger vision for the Wayne Theater, where it is a place where they produce certainly the series of musicals that are put on there, the children's programming and workshops for them. That's not something that I remember us ever talking about. In fact, we talked about the fact that we were not going to be a producing theater because the building does not have the kind of infrastructure that allows you to store and build and do the things you have to do to be a producing company. But somehow Tracy has managed to make that happen.
Yeah.
Bill, tell me the story. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to add something that's sort of a personal experience for me that brought home something. Tracy's talked a little bit about people showing up and saying, "Oh, I had my first date." But here a month and a half ago, we had Arlo Guthrie, who is a great musician that my age group knew very much from the 60s. And so we had a packed house, and doing the curtain speech, it just hit me that everybody in the audience had memories of 50 years ago from seeing and hearing his music. And that's what brought us there to that stage, to the auditorium that night. We were there to relive our memories. And it hit me that an awful lot of what is going on at the theater now for these kids that come and see these Broadway musicals that we do, plays, or what's being presented. We're creating the memories for them that 50 years from now, they'll seek out to relive. And to me, that it just hit a real warm spot for me that we are part of that continuum of making history and memories for people going into the future.
Hey, Bill, tell me the story about your mother. You'd been on the board before, and the movie. Didn't you go to a movie with her?
Oh, gosh. My mom lived a very full life, and as she was quick to say, I'm not ready for it to be full, meaning she wasn't ready for it to ever be over. But in virtually one of the last weeks of her life, she got to see, I'm gonna say it was White Christmas, and she said that was the first movie she ever saw at the Wayne Theater. And I thought that was special. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, did you go with her?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you were with her. So you got to go with your mom to that movie. So anyway. Well, anyway, Tracy, Dr. Myers, Dr. Clair Myers, my good buddy, all my good friends, Bill, thank you for doing this today. Is there anything?
Richard, before you end, let me say something. You know, it is the historic Wayne Theater, but it's also the Ross Performing Arts Center. And Ginny Ross, with the funding from her husband's expertise in the stock market and with her very generous son, has managed to put together a foundation for the Wayne Theater that will really allow it to move into the future, something that many of these other theaters around us, the ones that have closed, for instance, did not have and will not have. And so the Ross Performing Arts Center can be a long-term asset to Waynesboro because of that generosity.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Tracy,
and could I add something else, Richard?
Absolutely.
Okay. You know, in that light, we could not have made it without our major donors. We say we do this for the general public. The politicians are elected by the general public, but it's your donors that really make an opportunity like this become reality. And certainly Jenny Ross, Lucy Coiner, Gene Custon, you know, just great donors. And that's what makes this happen. I want to say too that these new markets tax credits, which I have badmouthed from the beginning of the interview, also set the structure in place that in December of this year, by being able to be and stay compliant with our payments to that, in December of this year, the Wayne Theater Alliance will own the Wayne Theater building free and clear. And that is marvelous. It is a difficult program. As I've said, the city of Culpeper, Virginia, started a beautiful, wonderful theater, so well thought out, except they didn't have the programming, which Tracy's put in place to sustain them. And they didn't have the donor base to sustain them. And they lost their theater within about 1.5 years of opening. The same thing could have happened to us. We had the city of Waynesboro, and go back to that performance agreement, that money that was supposed to come in was to make our payments to US Bank for this interim period until we owned it. And that money never materialized. And so we went forward with intense fundraising and bridging the gap, and we pulled it off. That's all based on the loyalty of your donors in creating something that's really important, which is the Wayne Theater. We're beginning to evolve a new, bigger idea. We admitted the fact that in 2006 and 7, maybe even 4, we were given the old gray building, which is a red brick building. We bought the old Fox and Hounds building, and we bought the building at the top of the hill. And we are now in planning discussions as to what comes next. How do we continue to support this great theater that is now part of Waynesboro? And how do we go to the next level? If we're going to continue to produce, what happens? If we're going to transcend to digital production as a result of what we're going through now, how does that happen? So we're in the new stage of envisioning the next future pages of the Wayne Theater. And in order to do that, we need those same donors and new donors to come to the table and help us move that forward. That is the biggest issue of the city not funding and not being the partner that they should have been, and having defaulted on this for the Wayne Theater. And it really transcends because the city has now started, just like they did when they accepted the Wayne, they've accepted and pursued with a group of volunteers the creation of the Virginia Museum of Natural History branch in Waynesboro. And the city's now said, oh yes, we want to help and we want this to happen. And they got a great group of volunteers that's working on it. But what will really make it happen is the donors and the volunteers. And until that trust is rebuilt, I think they've got a strong, long truck uphill to make that happen, to reproduce what we have done without the faith of your donors will be really hard. And I think the faith of donors in the city of Waynesboro has been hurt a lot. I think the future of what we can do together is incredibly bright. And so that's what I hope we can bring the donors back into the trust of the city, can begin to demonstrate a trust factor that will allow donors to come to the table again and make this museum happen, because that would really set Waynesboro on fire from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. So Bill, Tracy, Claire, it was good to see you again. Hope we next time we see, we can actually have a party where we can be like 2 feet apart instead of 6 feet apart. Anyway, thank you for doing this.
Richard, thank you so much for initiating this.
You're welcome.